To the Point with Michael Williams.
A plan that would cut down the chances of another toxic algae outbreak occurring on the Treasure Coast. That plan inching toward approval. What are the chances it will finally get done, and what will it mean? Good morning and welcome. As the Florida legislature heads into its final frenetic week, a question whether there will be the money to address the algae problem. It's a multifaceted approach and problem. Here's a reminder of how we got there. When the water levels get high or too high in Lake Okeechobee, water is released because of concerns about an old leaky dike. Water released east and west into the St. Lucie River and the Caloosahatchee River. And you on the Treasure Coast know full well what the outcome of that was. The water, algae blooms created last summer, a huge headache. Toxic algae everywhere. The legislature now considering $750 million to $800 million as a first down payment to build a reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee that would be used to hold excess water from the lake that then could be cleansed and moved south into the Everglades, which is starving for clean water. So again, it's a multifaceted approach. It's been debated for decades. And joining me now to discuss all of this, Eikenberg, CEO of the Everglades Foundation. You've been front and center on much of this debate. And so I suppose the first question is the simplest and the hardest one at the same time. $1.5 billion overall plan here. Stewart, Republican, and Florida Senate President Joe Negron's been the driver pushing for this. The plan scaled back. First question, is it going to happen? This scaled down version of this plan to send water south?
Well, as you alluded to, Michael, we're heading into the last week of the 60-day legislative session, concluding this coming Friday, May the 5th. We're one step closer to seeing that reservoir south of the lake come to fruition, one step closer to having it. The House of Representatives needs to take up Senate Bill 10. I was in Tallahassee a couple of days ago and saw the Speaker. We're confident that the House is going to take up that bill and pass it.
There seemed to be, at least as you read the critiques going back and forth, hesitation about how to pay for it, bonds, no bonds. I want to talk more about what it'll mean environmentally in a moment. But in terms of funding, it's still something of a fight. Are they going to get over that hurdle?
I think they are. They've been making quite a bit of progress here these last couple of days. Budget conference, that whole process within Tallahassee is moving its way forward. They need to pass the budget. The only constitutional prerogative that they have is to pass a balanced budget. Everglades funding, monies for these, dollars for this reservoir. We see part of this budget, part of Senate Bill 10 that President Negron has led on. We're getting closer to seeing this become a reality.
When we talk about the nuts and bolts of what will happen versus what was initially proposed, that in a moment. But first, one confusion I'll sometimes hear from viewers is this: wait a minute, we all approved Amendment 1.
Yes.
So what's the problem with coming up with the money for this? Explain where we stand there.
Well, you're right. 75% of voters 2 years ago, 3 years ago, passed Amendment 1. So we have the dollars available
for conservation
including the Everglades. So these restoration projects, this reservoir south of the lake that Congress passed 17 years ago is eligible for these Amendment 1 dollars. Joe Negron, Jack Latval in the Senate, Speaker Corcoran, they're moving towards using Amendment 1 for this purpose. That's the intent of the voter back in 2014. We're glad it's happening.
The plan initially from Senator Negron was 60,000 acres. Some of that would have had to come from Big Sugar, other agricultural interests. As has happened in the past, they pushed back hard. We've had them in as our guest. JP Sasser, one of their representatives, has come in. Other people have come in, talked to us, said, listen, we can't destroy agriculture there. We've talked to others who said, including Joe Negron, who said everybody's going to have to feel some pain. Ultimately, it wasn't going to fly past those interests. He scaled back the plan. Instead of 60,000 acres, 14,000 acres of already owned state land to create this reservoir, letting water flow out of the lake at times of need when the water levels are too high, clean it, move it south to the Everglades that badly needs it. That's the plumbing, correct? And perhaps we can go to some pictures of the big lake as we talk. Is that in essence the plumbing?
It is. It's the replumbing of the Everglades to reconnect Lake Okeechobee down to the Florida Keys. But I will say, viewers need to be reminded, this reservoir is not something that just was created by Joe Negron. This was passed by Congress 17 years ago. The second project authorized by the United States Congress 17 years ago. It's been 17 years in the waiting. No attack here on agriculture. Big Sugar was supportive of this project back when it passed. During the Jeb Bush administration, this reservoir started. Sugar a few years ago wanted to sell all of its land. 242 days, Michael, of a state of emergency last year.
Yeah.
We need this reservoir. This water has to go down to the Florida Keys.
But it's a much smaller project. So let's assume for a moment all goes well in your view and it passes. The question a lot of people have is, when would they start? It's state-owned land, and since it's 14,000 acres of already state-owned land, and they'd be deepening a reservoir there, by the way. It wouldn't be starting completely from scratch. Is it nearly enough land when the initial plan said we have to have 60,000 acres?
Well, the legislation, once it passes...
And you're looking at home, and you, Eric, at the algae problem we've talked about on the lake that's created so many problems on the lake and east and west.
When this bill becomes law, which is our hope, and many out there hope that as well, when that becomes law, the Water Management District will report back to President Negron and the legislature by January of next year to say, can we ensure that we have the volume of water that is necessary for this reservoir without violating water quality standards? You cannot send all this polluted water that you're showing on the screen now to the Everglades. You would kill it. Filtration, 60,000 acres of filtration marshes, man-made wetlands can remove the pollution in the water from the lake, and you're delivering clean water down to the Keys. Don't forget, you have 50,000 acres of dead seagrass in Monroe County, the Florida Keys, impacting tourism, impacting fishing and boating, because we're mismanaging the way water is supposed to flow in this system. This reservoir, 15,000 acres to start, but the bill calls for they have to ensure that you have the volume of water necessary, and if you cannot meet a water quality standard that's laid out, then you have to expand that footprint.
But you're going to run into the same issues with agricultural and sugar interests if you come back in a few years and say we want to expand from 14,000 acres to 20, 30, 40, or the original 60. Are you not?
But I would say, Michael, what President Negron and Chairman Jack Latval have placed in this bill is for the state to use state-owned land. There's 23,000 acres of state-owned land that's currently leased to Big Sugar, including 3,000 by the Department of Correction. You have Florida prisoners, inmates, harvesting sugarcane for some 50 cents a day. 3,000 acres, that lease is terminated in this legislation. Those 3,000 acres are then utilized. They need to be swapped, maybe with Florida Crystals, another one of the big sugar companies, and use those lands to expand that footprint. We don't care how big the reservoir is. You have to have the volume of water. It needs to be meaningful, and you have to send that so we can reduce these discharges east and west.
And do you have the mechanisms in place or about to be with some of the other planning to cleanse that water? So you get the reservoir, you still need to clean it as it moves south to the Glades.
Yes, and the governor 5 years ago negotiated a deal with Washington to expand these filtration marshes that I talked about south of all those sugarcane fields so you can clean the water. Congress passed what's called the Central Everglades Plan last year. That's going to remove all the man-made barriers in the central system so you get a more natural sheet flow. And they're bridging Tamiami Trail, US 41, connecting Tampa to Miami.
Allowing
12-foot
water
bridges
to flow south.
Yes, these are not bridges to nowhere. These are bridges to place water into Everglades National Park. And ultimately, this water makes it to the Florida Keys. They're desperate down there for fresh water.
Are agricultural and big sugar interests on board, at least with this modified plan at the moment? And if it calls for expansion, what do you say to those in those communities who have said on this program and others, we've been down there plenty, talking pro and con about this, you said, you all don't appreciate that you're going to wipe out agricultural interest or big sugar interest down there if this or any other expanded plan ever comes to fruition. What do you say directly to them?
You know, take the issue of this reservoir off the table. 10 years ago, Big Sugar went to the state of Florida, wanted to sell its land. For 10 years, there has been no effort to deal with the economic issues within those communities. It wasn't until Joe Negron stepped forward and said, let's put together job training, economic development opportunities for the Glades communities, and let's ensure those folks have a future. That's part of this bill. But make no mistake about it, by sending that water south, relieving the pressure on the dike, it's for the best interest of those communities. It's for the water supply of those communities, let alone the viewership here on the Treasure Coast. The Everglades is the source of our economic future. We're losing it. This project is vital of reconnecting the lake down to the Florida Keys.
If we can go back to the visual of the lake, I think people sometimes forget another huge component of this. Look at the lake. As water flows south from the lake, and in its natural state, the Everglades water would seep down into the natural aquifers that are our drinking water. So for people who say, I don't go to the lake or I don't care as much about the environment, if you care about your drinking water for a burgeoning, huge South Florida community south of the lake, then clean water in the Glades that then filters into aquifers and is used for our everyday drinking water is absolutely vital, one way or the other.
8.2 million of us rely on it, and it's important we do it. We're getting close.
Also, there are many components to this. We're going to see if this passes. You think, bottom line, it's a good first step towards redoing the plumbing.
Yes.
The governor's also talked about, there are many pieces to this, as you well know. One of them, he's saying, we need to go back and see about getting $200 million, you know, and get the feds back on board here. Talk about that, because there's the whole component about trying to refurbish. They've already begun this work, but refurbishing the entire dike to strengthen it. Talk about that and your concerns there. And are we doing apples to apples with that kind of argument?
Two separate issues.
Okay.
Lake Okeechobee, hardening that dike, repairing that dike is separate from Everglades restoration. Two separate funding streams, two different projects. This issue is more, in my view, a safety and welfare issue. That dike, 70-plus-year-old dike, in this post-Katrina world that the Army Corps lives in, they're concerned about a breach of that dike. Thousands of our fellow Floridians,
old earthen dike, built
old earthen dike that live near that dike. The money that's going to come out of Washington to harden that dike has to happen for the safety of the people that live around that dike. The issue of sending the water to this reservoir and ultimately down to the Florida Keys, that's part of Everglades restoration, to ensure that we replumb that system, re-engineer it for the quality of life that we all expect.
Has the governor and his administration done enough in your mind in terms of the architecture and pushing this plan, the overall architecture of Everglades restoration, and that includes pushing for money for the dike, filtration systems to the south, reservoirs and the like? What grade do you give the Scott administration?
The governor, if Senate Bill 10 in its current form gets to the governor's desk and he signs it, this is the last piece of a puzzle of reconnecting Lake Okeechobee down to the Keys. The governor
just as nature intended it.
Just as nature intended, but as we've screwed it up, we're fixing the sins of a previous generation. But the governor put up half the money for the next 2.6 miles of Tamiami Trail bridging. The governor endorsed and pushed hard for the Central Everglades plan. The governor put $880 million of state money to expand those filtration. The governor putting his signature on Senate Bill 10 and ensuring that we have a meaningful reservoir that takes the volume of water necessary to reduce these toxic discharges east and west. Because, you know, let's not just put a Band-Aid on this thing. This is a crisis. He has a chance to do it.
I did talk last summer extensively to biologists. Final question. Many of you on the Treasure Coast understandably say, wow, anything that could ease toxic algae crisis, great. We restore the environment. It's a win for them as well. Addressing, many argue, at least some of the concerns for the agricultural community. But I had some biologists say, wait a minute, don't think this is going to be a cure-all. You've got septic tank issues. In fact, many people south of the lake say you're ignoring the septic issues, the other urban runoff, urban pollution that's just as responsible, if not more so. And they also argue problems north of the lake for toxic algae. Is this going to be a magic wand? Or in a few years, are people going to look back and say, that did not really solve the problem here?
Everglades restoration is water quantity. The quality of the water is the sole responsibility of the state of Florida. This septic tank issue in these various local communities needs to be addressed. But the toxic water that we saw last year for 242 days is from Lake Okeechobee. We're still flushing toilets in these communities, and we're not seeing the algae that we saw last summer. The lake is the problem.
What about the argument from interests south of the lake who say fix the problems north of the lake, concentrate much more on that?
We've heard that. You build that reservoir north of the lake with nothing else, that reservoir is going to fill up, and that will need an outlet. The outlet for a northern reservoir with nothing else is Lake Okeechobee. It will rise. It will continue to put pressure. The answer then is dumping it east and west. The most vital outlet for the lake and the problems that Okeechobee faces is a southern reservoir, and 207 scientists said we need it.
Final thoughts on how excited you are, or cautiously optimistic as we head into the final week with the Florida legislature, that this will in fact get done, and can you overstate at the end of the day, however scaled back the plan is, its importance to our future? Final thoughts.
Well, I will say, having spent time in Tallahassee for a number of years, you wait for that white handkerchief to hit the ground in the rotunda on Friday.
And the ink to be dry on the paper.
And the ink to deal. So we're still pushing hard to ensure that it happens. I will say, though, what's different this time than in previous efforts, the business community has stepped up. Fishing, anglers, boaters, realtors, small business owners around this community went to Tallahassee, traveled to Tallahassee and packed committee rooms, stood up and told legislators it's time to ensure the money that we passed goes to building this project that's 17 years in the waiting. We're one step closer. We are optimistic.
Half of my career covering South Florida news, Miami and here, has been I've revolved at one point or another around coverage of this kind of story. Eric Eikenberg, CEO of Everglades Foundation, will be in touch as we see what happens on into next week. Thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you, Michael.
Coming up next, what we should look for above and beyond that as the legislature heads toward its final week.